Welcome back to Dreaming Against the Machine. I'm your host, Adam Becker. This week's guest is author and journalist and my friend, Annalee Newitz. Annalee writes both novels and nonfiction books. Her most recent novel actually is coming out in October of this year. It's called A Wall is Also a Road, and you can pre-order it wherever you get your books. But we spend most of this episode talking about her most recent nonfiction book, Stories Are Weapons, which is about psychological warfare. And I know that sounds pretty heavy, but I promise this is Dreaming Against the Machine, and we find a way to have fun with it, which is easy because Annalee is a fun person, and we always have a good time talking. So I hope you enjoy it. Annalee, welcome to Dreaming Against the Machine.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's see. How would I describe you? I would describe you as a science journalist and science fiction author, and also founder of a website that was near and dear to my heart, IO9, and just general cool person. I don't know if you feel that this is an accurate description.
I mean, very kind of you to say. I think very cool person should definitely be part of my bio.
Yeah, you should have it on business cards.
And I write books that are both nonfiction and fiction, but not in the same book. I don't mix them in the books. I keep them separate.
We've known each other for a while. How did we meet? I think it was Kishore's fault.
Kishore Hari brings lots of cool people together and is
almost
himself
professionally at this point.
Insanely cool. What an
Yes.
awesome guy. I think that is how we met, but also then I asked you to be my science advisor on my second novel, which
Yeah.
dealt with time travel. And I had this idea that there was a scientific way to do time travel. And you said the kindest and most helpful thing to me, which was, you were like, time travel. You're never going to have a technological device, but you can use it as a literary device. And I was like, all right, fair enough.
Yeah, that sounds like
it was a literary device in the book. It was
good. Yeah,
not
I'm glad that
science.
was helpful. I remember talking with you about it, and I guess I remember saying something like that. That sounds like something I would say.
I mean, you did say, like, sure, at a quantum level, maybe there could be time travel, but that's not what's happening in this book.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, I mean, science fiction is about having the conversation you want to have and using the science fiction as a setting to do it, not about, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we have rockets?
I mean, I like to make my science fiction as accurate as possible, but
Sure.
time travel was I think the one time when my science fiction was just completely speculative. Like, you could never have the time travel that these characters have. But in all of my other books, I think I've made stuff that's plausible that could exist.
So we were just talking about your science fiction, and your latest book is actually science fiction. It's Automatic Noodle. But I brought you here today in part because you're fun to talk to, but in part because I want to talk about your latest nonfiction book, Stories Are Weapons, which is about psychological warfare. I was reading it, and I already knew some of the stuff that I was reading in there, but I certainly didn't know all of it. And in particular, it was depressing to me to see that, 100 years ago, Walter Lippmann, the journalist, was saying, we've got a real problem with public persuasion and things that we would now call psyops.
Mm-hmm.
And then, a decade later, you have people coming in and saying, yeah, no, this is great. Let's use really dirty tricks to, influence public opinion and change, national and international policy. And of course, that was only a problem from like the 20s through the 50s and isn't a problem anymore. And we don't have that problem at all.
Completely solved, yeah.
Yeah, it's completely solved.
Yeah, that's why Stories Are Weapons is purely a historical look at psyops and culture war.
Yeah, I mean, that was really my first question was, why did you write this and why did you think anyone would care about it?
I mean, it's actually not a bad question because when I started working on the book, of course throughout my lifetime, we've never had a phase in our lives where we didn't have tons of propaganda, even if it was just advertising, right? We're so surrounded by ads, which really do grow out of propaganda. which I talk about it in the book a bit. But what I think when I started the book, it was around 2019, 2020. And I was pitching the book because as a science journalist, I'm very interested in history. I've written a lot about deep ecological time. I've written a lot about archaeology. I'm working on a book right now about archaeology. And so my impulse is always to turn to the past to understand what's going on around me. And of course, I think we can all cast our minds back to the faraway times of 2019 when we were absolutely in the middle of an onslaught of culture war and psyops in the United States. And maybe we can get into defining what psyops are in a second, because culture war and psyops are obviously not the same thing, although they're similar to each other. They sort of speciated at a certain point. And so that was what happened. Was I was like, how did we get here? What's even happening when I'm doom scrolling on my phone? Like, where did that come from? And so I immersed myself in the early history of the United States to look back and see how national programs had developed around propaganda, and it grew into this book, which I should say again is very focused on the U.S. because I think anytime you're talking about propaganda, you have to really situate it within a community or a nation, because propaganda really varies a lot across cultures. There's certain themes like lying and threats, but a lot of the particulars are very, very different.
Well, okay, so let's start with the definition that you were promising us. What's a psyop? How is it different from propaganda? How is it different from a culture war?
Yeah. So, like I said, they're all related, but I think what's really important to remember is that usually when we talk about psyops in a kind of classic sense, these are weapons developed by a nation and typically the military of the nation. Oftentimes there'll be an intelligence agency behind them, or at least involved in the creation of them. And a psyop is any kind of information. It could be a movie or a pamphlet dropped out of a plane that is intended to undermine the morale of an adversary. And again, in the classic sense, classic psyop, it's a foreign adversary. So you never do psyops against your own fellow citizens, fellow neighbors. They don't even have to be citizens, just people who live in your nation. But that has really changed over time, which again, we can talk about. But there are all of these other kinds of information warfare that really echo the psyop that don't necessarily come from an organized military or a nation. So culture war describes what happens when we start kind of lobbing psychological weapons at each other, but we're doing it, I guess you could say, recreationally. We're doing it in the media. We're not, there's no one being paid to come up with culture war. I shouldn't say that. There are some people who do.
I was going to say there are some people who are paid for this.
Yeah, classically, there are people who get paid for it now. But again, if you look back to in the United States, really World War I is when we're starting to codify a lot of these ideas, and certainly devoting a branch of the military to it with the Office of War Information during World War I. That was all very new stuff. To actually say, oh, yes, we could pay someone to make a word bomb. That wasn't really an idea. People were doing it before then, but it hadn't been professionalized. And so after kind of the rise of professional psyops, you start to see things like the Cold War. When that comes along, that really changes how we think of psyops, because that's when psyops start to kind of make the jump into culture war. And you start to see people in the media, people just even on the street or talking to their neighbors, kind of engaging in propaganda sometimes without even realizing it. And then the difference between all of that and propaganda, that's complicated, because propaganda is really, it's more like a genre. So what I like to do when I was teaching media studies, what I would tell my students is there's fiction, there's nonfiction, and then there's propaganda. Propaganda lives right in the middle of fiction and nonfiction, because propaganda is any kind of statement or form of communication that's intended to persuade the audience of something using an element of truth and a strong dose of fiction, a strong dose of an emotional narrative that may not have any evidence behind it whatsoever. But there's always that dose of truth and of nonfiction, factual information. So both culture war and psyops deal in propaganda, but lots and lots of other entities also produce propaganda, including, like I said, Madison Avenue, the advertising industry. They're great at propaganda.
Yeah, I was going to say, you just gave a definition that certainly applies to the advertising industry as well.
Mhm.
Also, I was hearing some clicking and clacking behind you, which it looks like that was a cat.
There is a cat in the room. Why don't we take a quick break while I let my cat
Well,
out?
no. Well, before you do.
Oh, no, is that okay?
we need to talk about the cat. We love cats on this podcast.
Oh, good. Okay,
Yeah.
well, my cat feels seen.
Yeah.
Although I can't see her, actually.
I saw her. She ran off. It looked like a black cat.
Yes, I have 2 black cats,
Okay.
infrared and ultraviolet. And indeed, ultraviolet, through no fault of their own, they grew into their names. So infrared is actually much larger than ultraviolet. So that's how you can tell the difference.
Larger but lower energy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Incredible.
She has bursts of energy, but yeah, generally not as energetic as ultraviolet. So
Incredible.
Yeah. So
Absolutely
they're
incredible. Okay.
occupying either end of the non-visible spectrum here in the house.
Amazing. Yeah. At some point, my cat may show up. I don't know if I told you this. I have a cat now.
Yeah, no, you did mention it. I look forward to seeing your cat.
Yeah, no, she often will just creep in while I'm talking and just hang out on the futon behind me.
Nice.
Because she wants to be in the same room that I am. Anyway,
I mean,
she's
she
also
might be a thought leader. You don't know. She could be a thought leader among cats.
Well, so it's funny that you say that. The Bobka is actually, her title on the podcast is she is our fearless leader.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Better than being your furless leader, which no shade on furless cats, but
no.
I like fur.
Yeah, fur on a cat, I think, is probably better for everyone, including the cat. Well,
I can see my cat in the background.
I was going to say,
climbing bags that are attached to the doorknob, which is not something she normally does.
Oh, well, that's definitely something that Bobka does. Anyway, this has been the podcast within a podcast about cats. Yeah, propaganda is definitely something that we see a lot of in advertising as well. But I also found myself thinking about when you said that, we do this for entertainment. There's something in the structure of social media. And maybe also the 24-hour news cycle, though I don't, the 24-hour news cycle has existed my entire life. I don't remember the world without it.
Same.
But certainly in the structure of social media, that seems to reward stuff that rides that line between truth and fiction the way that propaganda does.
Yeah, I mean, I think what is so seductive about propaganda is that when it's done well, it is like a really entertaining story that also promises to tell you a secret truth or an important truth. And I mean, anyone who's ever stumbled across a clickbait headline online knows that's the thing that's most clicky, is something that will reveal a real truth, but it's wrapped in a kind of a narrative, like a thriller narrative, or it's wrapped in a kind of romance narrative. Like oftentimes you can even start to recognize when propaganda is taking on certain fictional contours. For example, if you listen to the New York Times has a daily podcast, and they always play this sort of thriller-ish music at the beginning of the podcast, and they'll say, "It's Tuesday." And it always feels like the opening to like a procedural drama. And that's a real hallmark of how you use a kind of fictional gloss to make truth more exciting and more interesting to consume. And I'm not accusing the Times of engaging in propaganda all the time, but it is a way that nonfiction borrows from fiction in order to become entertaining.
I think surprising nobody, I was an NPR kid,
Well, same, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The household I grew up in
Raised
was an
on
NPR household. Yeah, exactly. And so I'm contrasting what you're telling me about the New York Times' daily podcast, which I don't listen to, and I didn't know that about it, with, the introduction to Morning Edition or something like that. Like, da 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 da.
Yeah, it's very cheerful and
Yeah.
wholesome. And which as a teenager, I hated. I was like very, very punk rock. And I was like, oh, what is this oatmeal crap
Wait,
that my parents were listening
punk
to?
rock? Really?
So I was a little suspicious of it, but I feel like now I have like nostalgia for, any kind of news broadcast that isn't trying to become some form of entertainment,
One of the questions that I think I want us to like think about in the course of this conversation is, okay, what is it about the structure of the existing news cycle and information ecosystem that rewards that stuff?
Yeah.
And what can we do to break out of it?
I think it's right to take us back to someone like Walter Lippmann, who's writing 100 years ago about the news. And I mean, he was the founder of the New Republic. So he himself was a producer of news, and he'd written for a lot of newspapers. But he also, during World War I, he worked at the Office of War Information. He was an American, so he was embedded with the U.S. military in the war. And he wasn't the only writer or journalist who did that. And the Office of War Information was in the business of making propaganda and also censoring the news. Like, censorship was a huge part of what they did. But that meant that they were constantly dealing with major newspapers all the time about what could be printed and what couldn't be. So I think that was a crash course for Lippmann in how psyops work, how, government mandated, formalized professional psyops work both domestically and in foreign adversary contexts. When the war was over, Lippmann wrote a book that we would now call kind of a thought leader book called Public Opinion. And what he was interested in doing in that book was just explaining to audiences at the time how mass media, which remember was still kind of a new idea, like the idea of mass media news was still, there'd only been a couple generations that had had access to that. And he was saying, we now have enough information about how mass media works that we can start to study it kind of sociologically and think about what are patterns in how people get persuaded, what are the kinds of messages that they respond to, and also, like you said, how do we kind of get away from that? And a lot of thinkers over the past 100 years have been either really enchanted with what Lippmann said or kind of pissed off at it, because he was a nuanced thinker. And one of the things that he points out is that all news in some way has to deal with what he called at the time stereotypes. And he actually popularized the term stereotype, and it meant something slightly different then than it does now. But what he meant was there's certain kinds of shorthand that we use in the news. For example, you might describe all Republicans in a particular way without, or all Democrats, and which, remember, at that time around the turn of the century had different meanings than they do now too.
Yes, indeed.
So that's interesting to think about. But he was saying, listen, you'd have an article where you say Democrats voted X way, and you don't have a lot of space in the article to get into the nuance of like, well, actually, there were 3 guys who were kind of not into it, and like maybe the vote wasn't quite what you think. He's like, look, when you have an hour deadline and you have to get this stuff down, you are by definition losing that kind of nuance. And you're kind of engaging in a certain amount of propaganda because you're reducing things to stereotypes. You're saying all Democrats did this thing. So that's why people get pissed at him, I think, is that they're like, no, but there has to be a way to do the news where you're not engaging in that activity.
No, keep going. I have thoughts, but yeah.
So Lippmann publishes this book, and I would say overall, the book has the effect of really just getting the American public thinking critically about their news and thinking about how the news frames historical issues, how conflict is framed, because that was a really big part of his concern with stereotypes was, what does it assume your audience knows? What are kind of the ways in which that changes how a story might be perceived? So people start thinking, wow, yeah, this is a big deal because the news media can, in fact, persuade people at scale. And the at scale part is the really important bit. Thinking about the public as a whole and how straight news media can make them vote differently, make them feel differently about a war, make them feel differently about women's rights, which was a really big deal at the time, et cetera. So a couple of years later, a advertising guy who also had worked in propaganda named Edward Bernays writes a book that's kind of in response to Lippmann's book. And he calls his book Shaping Public Opinion. And Bernays, he's an interesting guy. He's a nephew of Sigmund Freud. He's very interested in using psychoanalysis to help with this project of shaping public opinion. So Lippmann's out there saying, like, guys, public opinion is being manipulated. We need to think through this and think about the ethics. Bernays is like, guys, we can shape public opinion. Isn't that great? We can use it to, like, change the course of diplomacy. We can use it to sell cigarettes. We can use it for all kinds of neat stuff. Here's a book all about how to do it. So he's taking a really different tactic.
God.
And apparently he was a fan of Lippmann and kind of wrote to Lippmann and was like, hey, dude, check out my book. And Lippmann was like, I am not answering your mail.
Oh, God. Speaking of problematic people, I'm thinking of a scene in Annie Hall.
Uh-huh.
There's a scene in Annie Hall where some blowhard is pontificating about Marshall McLuhan.
Oh, yeah. And Marshall McLuhan steps out of line and is like, hello, I am Marshall McLuhan. You have understood nothing about my work.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. That was, as a kid, that was my first exposure to Marshall McLuhan.
Same.
I was like,
Yeah.
who's that guy?
Yes.
Some Canadian. So, yeah, I mean, but of course, Lippmann didn't have that ability to kind of step out of line. But he did get to found a very important magazine
Yes.
and, continue to cover a lot of important topics in American media. So basically, though, if you think about the Lippmann-Bernays, the verses of it all, the fight between them, I would argue that Bernays kind of won.
Yeah.
And he winds up having an incredible career in advertising. And then he goes on to do covert work for the CIA in Guatemala in particular. That's the one that he's kind of remembered for the most. So he combined his knowledge of advertising and his knowledge of politics to do, essentially dirty work. He was planting stories in the U.S. media about how the Arbenz government in Guatemala was dealing with the Soviets. There's no evidence that they were taking money from the Soviets or that they were acting on behest of the Soviets. It was a liberal government that wanted to take back land for local farmers, land that had been owned by colonial powers. And that was like their main campaign was just like, hey, we'd like to control our own farmland. And the company that became Chiquita Bananas was not psyched about that. And so they hired Bernays. So it was Chiquita, which was at the time called United Fruit. They kind of hire him, and then he's working also with the CIA to plant these stories. So he's using his skills as an advertiser because as an advertiser / marketer, you always want to be planting stories in the media about like your product, right? Like whatever it is. Bananas are great. And he actually had been working on banana campaigns because apparently in the 50s, North Americans were not sure about bananas and didn't really know how to use them. So he had planted all these stories about like great ways to use bananas, which at the time were mostly sold in cans, which just sounds so horrible. So how to use canned bananas in your like Jell-O or whatever in the 50s.
Yeah, I'm thinking about those 1950s like Jell-O salads.
Yeah. I guarantee that was part of his propaganda. Jell-O salad propaganda. But actually, I don't have a citation for the Jell-O salad thing, so I don't want to.
Okay,
I don't want to make that claim. But but
canned banana is bad enough.
Right. He was advocating on behalf of canned bananas and then became someone who was advocating on behalf of destroying the Guzman presidency there. And indeed, the CIA did successfully wage this campaign, both a military campaign and a propaganda campaign. So he was instrumental in getting a more U.S.-friendly regime put back into Guatemala at the time.
Do you know, I mean, this is a complete derail and I apologize, but do you know if this is where we get the term Banana Republic?
This is part of that. I mean, Banana Republic comes from, there's a number of Central and South American countries that were banana republics, right? Like places where colonial powers came and grew bananas there, right? So yes, but it is absolutely part of the genre of Banana Republic activity. Yeah. So this is classic Banana Republic shit.
Good. Yeah.
So my point is that what's interesting about Bernays as a figure is that he bridges the gap between advertising and formalized psyops. And he makes that jump into bed with the CIA in the 1950s. It's a really important moment where things start to change dramatically in terms of public sentiment about propaganda and public sentiment about psyops, because the Cold War isn't just a war between the US and communism. It's also a war at home. It's a culture war. And it's a war of the US government against US citizens. And the US government starts using all these strategies that they developed during World War I and World War II to fight foreign adversaries. And they start using it against people at home. So there's the witch hunts against communists, closely followed by witch hunts against gay and lesbian federal workers. And we also see, of course, tremendous crackdowns at that time on the burgeoning civil rights movement as well. And that's when you start seeing covert activity, people following MLK around. And then later in the 60s, you get things like COINTELPRO. So it's a real sea change. I say it's kind of like a weapons transfer program where things that had been used only in the military, only to demoralize our foreign enemies, are now being used to demoralize American citizens. And I would argue that we're still kind of in that moment as a country, that we're still right there with the idea that, you know what, it's actually kind of okay that we're using these military-grade psychological weapons against Americans because that's just become the norm. It hurts.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we started in a bad place and now we've gone all the way down. Awesome. So what do we do about it? How do we fix this? How do we get out of this?
There's two things that we need to be doing. I think first, we kind of have to go start again at square one with our old buddy, Walter Lippmann, and start thinking about identifying propaganda when it's happening. Because I think right now we're in a moment in terms of our media consumption where we're just bombarded with so much information, so much of which is false or misleading or propagandistic, that it's really hard to just take a beat and say, wait, is what I'm reading, is that evidence-based or is that just vibes? You know, is this just some kind of fantasy that's coming from, you know, a political party or just a random political weirdo on the internet? So what I really advise is go back to first principles, think about what a psyop does. So psyops, as I said, they're intended to demoralize the enemy, and they work kind of in three registers. One is they always contain a grain of truth. They are always also embedded in misrepresentations or lies, and they also often contain a threat, either an overt threat, like if you don't surrender right now, we will kill you, or something that's a little bit more subtle, like if you don't obey the rules, your job might be in jeopardy. And by the rules, I mean things like if you don't dress appropriately to work, or if you don't shut up about trans rights, or if you try to blow the whistle on ICE coming to your house. You know, it's just kind of rude. We don't like that at this workplace. You know, we don't want you to be late because you're blowing your whistles all the time. And so just keep that in mind. All of that stuff falls under what traditionally would be called a psyop, but now it's out in the wild. It's just part of the culture war that we're in. So we need to start thinking as we consume whatever it is, if we're on Blue Sky, if we're watching CBS, if we're reading a book, we need to start thinking about, is this, like, what is the message that I'm getting here? Is someone trying to persuade me of something? Do I sense misrepresentation in here? Is there some kind of threat that's, implicit in what I'm reading, a threat against me or against someone else? What's really happening beneath the sheets here? The other thing that I recommend people do if they're trying to identify whether something is propaganda or part of information warfare is remember that there's three basic ways that I'm very three-pilled, so everything is in threes. There's three basic ways.
So you're an LLM, is what you're saying. You
Yeah, probably a little bit.
Yeah.
Or at least I've swallowed all the LLM propaganda.
Oh,
so,
God.
And then I barfed it up. It's okay. I'm just anyway. This metaphor is really it's really going way too far. But there's three types of insult that you often hear in culture war statements. Like three ways that you will that basically people will try to use to undermine your morale. And one is to call you stupid, one is to call you crazy, and one is to call you evil. And I use some of those words, which are nasty words. I'm using them like in quotes. Like this is literally what happens. And you see it all the time. For example, you'll see a news article which is about trans healthcare, but no trans person will be quoted in the article. And implicitly, the reason why no trans person is being quoted is because they are viewed as being too compromised to talk about themselves. And that falls under crazy. That's always, anytime there's a marginalized group that we aren't allowing to advocate for themselves, oftentimes it's because implicitly the authority, whoever is creating this piece of media, is saying that those people they're just too mentally off. They're either too dumb or too crazy to speak for themselves. And in my book, Stories Are Weapons, like a huge part of the book is devoted to all the insidious ways that these basic schoolyard insults get turned into like scientific proposals and like studies and grants and like advertising campaigns and propaganda campaigns that masquerade as being something perfectly reasonable, but are at bottom just like a kid calling you stupid on the playground.
So there's two different directions that I want to take this. I'm two-pilled, I guess.
Yay!
I mean, I do this a lot, actually. I say, like, I have two things, and then those two bifurcate further, and then suddenly there's 128 things. But yeah, okay. So
you want to talk about solutions?
I want to talk about solutions,
yeah.
And I want to and part of the reason I want to talk about solutions, or part of the way I want to do it, is I want to push back on what you just said a little.
Yeah.
But also I want to talk about the connection to science. I hear what you're saying, like, because when it comes to solutions, like, I hear what you're saying. You're totally right about identifying the pattern. That makes a lot of sense. But I worry about saying, like, okay, well, we need to think more critically about the stories that we're being fed. Like, is this evidence-based, so on and so forth? Because I see a lot of people, and maybe this is just my media bubble, but I see a lot of people on the internet pointing to various things and saying, oh, that's a psyop, or that's propaganda. Or positing, various conspiratorial-like thinking around various things, some of which, okay, that's probably true, it's justified, and some of which is just, no, that's just a thing that happened, Like, I keep thinking about, the classic essay by Richard Hofstadter, right? The Paranoid Style in American Politics. And one of the things that Hofstadter says in that essay is, this idea of like shadowy evil cabals controlling U.S. or world politics goes very far back, not just in U.S. political thinking, but just in, political thinking around the world. And he says, one of the functions that it serves is that it posits a simpler world than the one that we actually live in, where everything is connected and there are levers of power that can be seized. And yes, the bad news is they're in the hands of some, ill-defined enemy, or sometimes, too well-defined enemy of like a particular cultural or ethnic minority. But it means that they're there for the taking. And so all you have to do is suppress that, scapegoated group of whatever kind, and then you can seize those levers of power, and then you'll be in control. And I just, maybe I'm Hofstadter pilled. But discussing the different ways that we're pilled here on Dreaming Against the Machine. But
I mean, it's,
yeah.
pills of the future, man.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when I see people saying, oh, that's a psyop, that's propaganda, I'm like, some of this is just you thinking that the world is more coordinated than it actually is.
I'm super glad that you brought that up, because especially right now, one of the things that is so frustrating is that I would almost say that we're living in a world of meta propaganda, because one form of propaganda is to flood the zone with bullshit, right?
Yeah.
And one of the people who I think is brilliant at talking about this is Peter Pomerantsev, who has a new book out pretty recently, I think from last year, called How to Win an Information War. But he's spent his whole career studying how propaganda works in closed regimes, but also increasingly in so-called open regimes like the United States. And one of the things he always points out, because he does have a lot of background in Russia, is that flooding the zone with misinformation and getting people thinking that everything is propaganda and that everything is a psyop actually plays into the hands of people in power. Because when you get that confused and you trust nothing, and you're being told that the media is fake the way Trump always does, then you're kind of ripe for being manipulated by a very powerful authoritarian figure who promises to deliver you that secret truth that I talked about at the beginning of the episode. Because the lure of finding out the secret truth is so powerful, especially when you're surrounded by this like fog of information war.
Yeah.
And it is a fog. So I think that that's hugely toxic. And I agree that it's only step one to identify when something is a psyop. And then step two is to actively produce counter narratives. And I don't mean that in the simplistic way of like more speech is free speech, because you don't want to add to the fog, right?
Yeah.
You want to be able to develop stories and ideas and messages that are clear, that are evidence-based, but also that are fun. And I think that's one of the things that really gets lost, especially when we're talking about science, because I think any of us who are really science-minded and really love the idea of like rational debate, we're like, well, all we need to do is peel away all of the pyrotechnics and the silliness, and then everyone will, agree with us that climate change is real. We'll just cite the truth. We have these statistics. Yeah. And that is so freaking important. And like, thank goodness that people are citing statistics and doing that work. But in order for public opinion, as Lippmann would put it, in order for public opinion to be swayed, that stuff has to be put into a narrative that people are excited about. And actually, there's a great new film by Boots Riley called I Love Boosters, which is a great example.
Yeah.
It's so great. He's our local guy. He's an Oakland filmmaker. And he also did the film Sorry to Bother You.
I love that movie. Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
And both Sorry to Bother You and I Love Boosters are about propaganda very much. But one of the things that Riley has said in interviews is that he wanted to make a film, explaining to people that they were being propagandized and dealing with issues around class conflict and, billionaires having too much power and too many resources. But he wanted it to be fun. And so he made this comedy that's just this goofy romp that's really silly and joyful, but has these moments where like the characters unionize. That's not a spoiler. It's a Boots Riley movie. You know there's going to be a union in there. But it's not, it doesn't feel heavy-handed. It doesn't feel like it's like, and now kids, let's talk about class warfare. It's spontaneous. It's something that the characters do that's in character. And so you're really just following the story of these people. And I think that's something that we forget, especially progressives, especially science-minded people. We kind of forget about the fun. And fun is like a huge part of getting people to come over to your side. And inviting them into your perspective is to say, like, hey, I'm going to show you a good time. And while I'm showing you a good time, like, hey, maybe like learn a little bit about what it means to do, predictive models for the climate. And, you know what? This could actually help you fight fires. You don't like fires, right? Fires suck. And then you can kind of meet people in a more human way instead of kind of presenting yourself as an expert who knows everything.
Annalee, are you saying or suggesting that math isn't fun?
I think actually math is really fun.
Yeah,
and I only know that from like, starting learning about math on like Sesame Street and from, like cartoons that taught me about how math is really cool. And later, math became cool to me because I got really interested in urban infrastructure. And you can't have a bridge without math.
That's true.
And that's really exciting. It's really exciting to think about math in context. And so you tell the story of why, for example, something that happened in my hometown of San Francisco was they redid some of the struts on the Golden Gate Bridge, and it caused wind to make this whistling sound as it passed through the bridge. I think they fixed it now, but it was really uncanny. And like, again, that's a math story and a physics story. Why is the bridge singing? So I think we all know that this stuff is fun. And we know that having access to resources is also really great for all kinds of people. And so stories about how we can make that happen using math or using, better agricultural science, those can be really fun stories too. So ingredient number one in fighting this shit is tell better stories and get those stories out however you can. It doesn't have to be, I think we're stuck on this idea that like, well, if I don't publish this story in the New York Times or if I don't have something on television, no one will ever know. And that's just not true anymore. Like you can be doing it in a classroom. You can be doing it on the street. You can be doing local theater productions. You can be, posting on social media. You can be doing all kinds of things to educate people and to like correct the stories that they're hearing from unreliable sources. But another big piece of what I advocate for in Stories Are Weapons is doing a lot of looking back through history and telling stories about history that place our present moment in context. Because one of the things that happens when you get drowned in propaganda is you start to be in this endless, horrifying present moment where you feel totally disconnected from the past. You feel like the past isn't even relevant to you. And the future is a total unknown. So you're just stuck and you can't think your way out of the present moment because all of the past models don't seem relevant, which is totally untrue. If you actually look back through US history, it's like, we've been here before, including in these hyper propaganda moments like the Cold War. And we made it through. And there were tools that we gained as we made it through that really helped, like direct action, political organizing, opening libraries that had archives of information. Like one of the really awesome parts of working on Stories Are Weapons was I got to talk to Indigenous archivists and researchers who were preserving history of how the US government had tried to eradicate their tribes and relocated their tribes. And they'd been told, actually, there's no historical records whatsoever of what happened. And then they went to the, Library of Congress and the National Archives and found all this history and brought it back to their tribal elders and have copies of it in their local libraries, like not just their tribal library, but also the university libraries that are nearby. So it's really important that we preserve that history and we keep it in mind and remember that there's good tools there and we can learn a lot from it.
Unfortunately, we still live in capitalism, and that means we need to talk about our partners and sponsors. But fortunately, our partners and sponsors are great. And if you want to support Dreaming Against the Machine directly, you can join us on Patreon, where $5 a month gives you the chance to ask questions of upcoming guests and a dedicated stream of cat pictures. We love our patrons, and we also love being a part of the Multitude Collective at multitudeshows.com. Multitude is a podcast company made up of passionate people creating shows you can count on. Shows like Spirits. Spirits is a history and comedy podcast focused on everything folklore, mythology, and the occult, told through the lens of feminism, queerness, and modern adulthood. Every week, mythology buff Julia and her childhood best friend Amanda get together to learn about a different story from mythology and folklore over drinks. Everything from the mythological origins of major franchises like Lord of the Rings and Wonder Woman, to modern urban legends, to a roundup of werewolf stories from around the world. Dive in at spiritspodcast.com or search for Spirits wherever you download your podcasts. And here's a word from our sponsors. One of this week's sponsors is Shaker and Spoon, a monthly cocktail and mocktail subscription. Full disclosure, they sent me a free box this month, and I'm excited to try it on a night off soon. Each box includes 3 original recipes from award-winning bartenders, with enough ingredients to make 4 of each of those drinks for at least 12 drinks in total. And each box includes everything you need to make the drink except for the alcohol. And they're built around 1 spirit per box, so you really just need 1 bottle of something that you probably already have on hand if you drink. And if you don't drink, every box includes 0 proof options for every recipe, and some of the drinks are designed to be completely spirit-free from the start. The boxes come with recipe cards that include guidance on mixing techniques and glossary of terms that teach you how to shake, stir, build, and garnish these unusual cocktails with eclectic ingredients. And they also include everything else that you need to try out these drinks, like custom syrups, bitters, extracts, garnishes, and aromatics. And so you can try the drinks without going off and buying full bottles of niche ingredients that you'll never use again. It's a great idea for date nights or hosting a party or bringing a gift to someone else's party. And you can always skip or swap boxes or even just buy individual kits or ingredients without subscribing. So you can try this stuff out at their website, shakerandspoon.com. Use code DATM for 10% off your purchase. So one of the things I like about this is I feel like there's, in the same way that there's like a great man theory of history that I think is bullshit and I try to push back against, there's something that I think of as the great man theory of science communication. That the way that you solve a problem like climate denial is you put a bunch of climate deniers in a room and then you put like a Carl Sagan in the front of the room and then they learn that they're wrong.
The debate me bro style.
Yeah,
of
exactly.
persuasion.
And that's just not how anything works.
It's true. And it's funny because for anyone who's ever watched like the Jubilee channel on YouTube, which is also like you can see it on TikTok and IG and everything, debate itself has become a form of propaganda and entertainment. And that whole idea of like, debate me, bro, which is done often in really bad faith. Like it's people arguing, even though they're arguing about human life, they're treating it like a game. And it's really super unhelpful. And I think it really misleads people about why we have debates in the first place.
Yeah.
Because the point is to actually try to reach agreement and compromise. Like the point of debate is not to just state 2 opposing opinions and walk away with like a cloud over your head or to have people score how cool you were while you were debating. Like the point is we live in a democracy. We have to compromise. Like that's the whole frickin' point. So we debate until we're like, fine, I'll give up the one thing if you give up the one thing. And then we'll have the thing that we kind of agree on. That's the juicy, cool part of the debate that you just never see.
But Annalee, I thought that Charlie Kirk was doing politics the right way.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Actually, it turns out he's doing them the wrong way. And I know, like, but that in itself, that statement, I love that you said that because that is propaganda.
Well, yeah. Also, I'm never going to pass up an opportunity to rag on Ezra Klein, but please keep going.
Oh, no, me too. Yeah. I fully appreciate your project here. But I mean, it is important to remember that Ezra Klein is a great example of kind of your great man theory of communication, right? Of science, of ideas communication.
Yeah. Because I was going to say it's not just science.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But in Stories or Weapons, I talk about this idea of false rationality, which is a style of address and presentation. It's an aesthetic. And the aesthetic is, I am more calm than you are. I am more rational than you are. I am now going to explain to you, like your very favorite high school teacher, what's actually happening. And if you disagree with me, the problem is that you're just kind of hysterical and you're too emotional. And what we're doing here is we're just considering ideas. And one of the ideas we have is that immigrants should be locked up in prisons. And that's just an idea. Like, why do you need to get emotional about that? Why do you need to get emotional about the idea of trans people being denied healthcare? I mean, it's just an idea.
Yeah.
You know, I'm pretending to be Ezra Klein here. I'm sure he never used those exact words.
Of course. Yeah.
And we're just using him as a type. Like, you know, there's plenty of other guys out there. And
I mean, the people you're reminding me of are some of the people from my own book, from More Everything Forever, the rationalists saying, well, but, you know, we're just discussing the idea of whether or not Black people are genetically inferior to white people. It's just an idea. Why are you getting emotional about it?
And I actually have a huge section of my book about that exact idea, about the bell curve and about this long-standing history in the United States where white people really, really, in a kind of hysterical, paranoid way, want to assert that Black people have inferior intelligence. And it's like, first of all, going back to my playground insult point, calling someone dumb is truly a playground insult. But also, you only say that if you're scared that you're the dumb one. And so it's very much a giveaway. It's like white people are like, I swear I'm not dumb. Like, these guys are dumb. And it's like, yeah, no, you're dumb.
Well, definitely. And that also
nobody's dumb. Like, that's the point. But yes, anyone who's making that argument is automatically, I would say, foolish.
I agree. But this also brings us back to stuff about science and how it intersects with all of this and the way that science is perceived. One of the things that I worry about, science depends on public funding, right? We've built this infrastructure in this country where you know, where we have public funding for science, and other countries around the world have done the same thing too. And now we have an administration in this country that is dismantling that infrastructure and trying to turn it to their own ideological ends and talking about gold standard science without actually defining what gold standard science is, and intervening in what had been a, you know, scientific process of peer review of grants. And I look at this and I think, well, this is the creation of a propaganda machine under the banner of science.
Again, to go back to the Cold War, this isn't the first time that science has been used as propaganda. Right. And the longer that we insist on this idea that science isn't political, the more we blind ourselves to that history.
You just hit one of my hot buttons. I'm so angry when people say that science isn't political. Science is political. Science has always been political. How could it not be political? It's an activity that humans engage in. Politics is something that happens the minute you have more than one person in a room.
It's so true. Yeah. It's very true. And there's been so many amazing books written about the politics of scientists, of funding for science. But what I think is really interesting is I think because people get so obsessed with this idea of science being objective and apolitical, they forget that there's always been right-wing and left-wing science, or progressive and conservative science. And they've always been battling it out. And science has, at least for the past 150 years, been a political football. Like, who gets to use science, and what kind of science? And right now, as you've chronicled brilliantly in your book, like, we're at this moment where certain kinds of science, like the development of LLMs and other kinds of algorithms that are called AI, that's being hyper funded. And that does lead to other kinds of science being funded or gaining access to resources sometimes. But then other types of science, like environmental science or the science around civil engineering, that stuff is now being starved, and many other kinds of science too.
Yeah.
And so there's always this like push and pull around what is legitimate science and what isn't. And we really need to be, again, back to my point about telling stories and being aware of our history, we need to be thinking about how we can promote what I call just progressive science, which
Yeah.
is, and by progressive, I really mean it like in a basic sense of like the government should be funding basic research, science should be taught in school, people should learn about the scientific method. Science helps us solve problems around health and
Yeah.
around traffic in cities and around, how to explore our world.
No, I mean, this is to me one of the things that drives me up a wall when people say that science isn't political. Not only is it, inexorably political because it's a human activity and all human activities end up being political, but also if you say that science isn't political, you make it politically toothless. You reinforce the status quo and deny science's power to try to change the status quo, right? Because if we're going to have science-informed policy, that means that science is political. And if science isn't political, then how are we supposed to use it to inform policy? Because, you know what? I think that we should be doing more to address the climate crisis. And that is an opinion that I have that is based on science. And if you disagree with me, I'm going to say that you're ignoring the science. And that means the science is political, and I don't care.
Yeah. I want to run something by you that I've been thinking about for a while, which is that one of the things that I think conservatives, and particularly like the reactionary type that we associate with the MAGA movement, why they find science so challenging is that the scientific method is about two things. I mean, it's about a lot of shit, but two things that are important. One is that you always re-examine your assumptions and that all truth is provisional. So you never reach like ultra super truth. Even if it's like, well, but gravity works all the time. It's like, you're always open to the idea that like, whoops, we found a new thing that means gravity is totally different. That's really challenging. The idea that truth could change at any time and like might be rapidly changing right now. That's really scary. The other thing about science is that in the scientific method, truth is based on consensus. And, the consensus doesn't always work. Sometimes the consensus goes in the wrong direction and we get 50 years of people arguing about plate tectonics because a lady discovered it and we don't like that. But that is the method, is that we come together as a group of peers and we hash it out and we try to reach consensus. We don't do the Jubilee thing, the Charlie Kirk thing of like, well, you think this, I think this. It's like, no, we get to a point and then that point can be changed. Like that's a moving target. But that's why I just think that the scientific method can feel like progressive politics, because it's all based on this idea that we reach a provisional consensus and we keep having revolutions. We never stop having revolutions, because if we don't, we stop being able to aim at truth and aim at evidence. We start just going off onto like some weird, I don't know where we go. To the land of not truth.
Okay, so first of all, going back to a different podcast within the podcast of etymology, my understanding, and I could be wrong about this, but my understanding is that the usage of the word revolution to mean like a political revolution as opposed to like a physical motion actually goes back to the Copernican revolution in science, where, the motion and the change in thinking were one.
Yeah. I mean, even if that's not true, let's just say it's true.
Yeah. This is our headcanon. Yeah, this is our headcanon about the history of science. That's what we do here.
But also, like, when you think about in the 19th century, Karl Marx, who was a philosopher of revolution more than anything else, I think now his name is associated with many, many things that he would be very puzzled by. But he really wanted his theory of revolution to be based in science. And he talks all the time about like what we really need is a scientific understanding of history, which again, maybe that was wrong-headed, but that was what he was trying to do. And I feel like that's kind of what we're still trying to do in this place where science and culture meet, or where science and politics meet. We're like, how can we have an evidence-based approach to public policy, to economics, to discovery?
I completely agree. And I'm so tempted to take us down another derail here and talk about one of our shared passions, science fiction, and how thinking about Marx wanting to have a science of history sounds an awful lot like something from one of the most famous foundational pieces of science fiction, Foundation.
Psychohistory,
exactly. But instead, I'm going to say that we are going to have to leave that for another time. And I think that actually this is a pretty good place to wrap it up. So, Annalee, thank you so much for coming on and talking with me about this. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thanks for letting me expostulate.
Of course.
I kind of just wanted to say expostulate.
Thanks again to this week's guest, Annalee Newitz. Next week, we have science fiction author Becky Chambers, and I'll be completely honest with you, I'm a huge fan of hers, and it took everything I had not to just fanboy out at her, but I think it was a great conversation and a great episode. To submit questions for future guests and to suggest other guests, and to see more pictures of Babka, join the conversation on Patreon. You can also find us on YouTube, on Instagram at DATMpod, on the web and on Blue Sky at dreamingagainstthemachine.com, or just find us wherever you get your podcasts. Dreaming Against the Machine is a proud member of Multitude Productions. Our executive producer is Nick Carissimi. Our theme music is by Jared Emerson Johnson. Our show logo is by Nick James. And our fearless leader is Babka, the greatest cat in the observable universe. I'm Adam Becker, and I'll see you next week.